Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is episode 7 of our History of Warfare series. I'm again joined by Terminal Philosophy, and we're here to discuss the Scythians and the Sarmatians. Now, we recently finished the Syrians, and we mentioned that the Syrian Empire was fatally weakened by a great raid of the Scythians that penetrated as far south as Egypt. And we think it's important to mention the Scythians and the Sarmatians together because the Sarmatians seem to be a subtribe of the Scythians, and they create a cultural set of norms and tactics and traits that will govern steppe society for the next 2,000 years. And so before we get to the Scythians themselves, we maybe want to talk a little bit about the steppe. For those who remembered our lecture about Mackinder, this is exactly the kind of region and the kind of history that he was using to come up with his theories. And the steppe can be broadly divided into two areas, the eastern steppe and the western steppe. And if we look at that, we have the eastern steppe is Asia, China, Mongolia, Siberia. The western steppe is Ukraine and Kazakhstan, mostly. And the Scythians are living in the western steppe. And so one of the things that we see is that in the western steppe, the ethnic background tends to be more Iranic or Indo-European, and the eastern steppe tends to be more Turkic and Mongolian. So with China, there'd be the Shuangnu, and they tend to be the Proto-Mongolians and the Huns. But the Scythians, are being Indo-Aryan, are probably of a similar ethnic stock to the Persians and even to the Greeks. But what we do know is that the steppe is generally fertile for pasture land, maybe not so much for farming, which leads to a large surplus of animals that one can hunt, horses, gazelles, and other such things. And the horse, of course, is a necessary precondition for steppe life. The steppe doesn't really lend itself to large urban settlements, which tends to be why these nomadic peoples converge on a deracinated existence. And we see that the further west you go on the steppe, the more, due to the weather patterns, the more fertile the grazing pasture land was. And we already mentioned how the chariot was invented in this area around 1500 BC. By around 1000 BC, the chariot had been swapped out for the horse. Now, it's not entirely clear if these Proto-Scythian or more broadly Indo-Aryan tribes that used the chariot had the same sort of cultural norms and values that the Scythians would later have. But needless to say, by the time we get to the Scythians, it would seem that the chariot had already been out of favor. In fact, probably by the time of the Cimmerians, it was out of favor. And they began the classic nomadic strategy of hit and run horse archery. So the horse archer, the classic steppe warrior motif, coupled with a war of attrition, trading land for time, and using ruses and Parthian shot and feigned retreats. All of this, which we'll get into a bit later, was sort of coalesced around the Scythians. And so, Terminal Philosophy, what are some of your thoughts about the steppe and this intervening period?
Right. Well, with the Scythians, as you said, it should go without saying that much of what defined their place in history was shaped by their geography, and the Eurasian landmass has this long belt of grassland, excuse me, that is really as far east as Manchuria and goes as far west to the Hungarian plain in Central Europe. Really, because there are only river valleys to cross, traveling on horseback, which again we'll get into as far as warfare is concerned, could mean that a certain clan or a group of people could travel thousands of miles before the next winter. This is actually far more significant than most people are aware, because this geography alone is the sole reason that so many factions of nomadic peoples throughout history were able to travel from Central and East Asia into Europe. Of course, this includes the more famous Genghis Khan and the Golden Horde and the Mongols, the Magyars, and so on and so forth. As it just as a term, the Scythians are a bit of an umbrella term, as they're really a confederation of different steppe peoples. And as you mentioned before, their linguistics and language are really Iranian in origin. Since we are kind of back in the Bronze Age, it's important to note that, really the best sources that we have available on the Scythians are Herodotus and really just archaeology. And so one thing that Herodotus did account for on his expedition is that there was hardly any iron or steel to anywhere, but what there was a lot of was bronze and gold. And of course, the Scythians are known for having their golden combs that have been found in like countless burials, as well as a lot of golden trinkets, and a lot of nobility were buried with gold. And a lot of the armor that their nobility used was scaled bronze. And as we were talking before this video, it's probably because of the nomadic nature of their society, the armor that they were buried with was probably acquired through plunder, through places south of the Caucasus Mountains, or really just in the modern day Iran. And so yeah, the steppe really allows for this nomadic, non-sedentary sort of life. There's really no infrastructure to watch over or to defend. Really, the geography just set the stage for steppe cultures for the next 2,000 years. I think that's all I'll probably say as far as geography goes.
Okay. Now, some of the elements of the Scythians that we see as a recurring theme throughout the history of the steppe is from the earliest written records. We find this intense level of cruelty, scalping of captured or of executed soldiers, wearing like cloaks of scalps, human sacrifice. They worship the sword of Ares. And we see that 1,000 years later, Attila the Hun could wield the tribes of the nomads together by claiming to find the sword of Mars. So we can see that this motif of the war god's sword still is a powerful motivating principle 1,000 years after the Scythians. And they would sacrifice animals and humans captured in war to it. And their ferocity and cruelty was every bit a match for the Assyrians. Maybe that's why they beat the Assyrians. They were just crueler and more vicious. Because they were nomadic and mounted on horses, they had strategic mobility. Of all the ancient peoples, the Scythians had the greatest amount of strategic mobility. I think on horseback, horsemen could easily cover 20 miles a day. The only really effective way to stop them would be to create a no-go zone of scorched earth, which Alexander the Great would later use in Bactria to essentially create a buffer between his empire and the nomads beyond. It was just all wasted out, so you couldn't ride your horse through it to live off the pasture land. The other thing is with the composite bow, we have probably, until at least the longbow, and maybe not even then, the most powerful and brutal range device until gunpowder. And from millennia after millennia, these nomadic horse archers just decimated sedentary armies, because again they married strategic mobility with firepower, with the case of the bow, and creative tactics like hit and run tactics, fighting dirty. The Scythians were renowned for their poisons, mixing often the venom from pregnant female snakes with blood, among other things. And they would dip their arrowheads in it. And extremely, extremely brutal and cruel people. We also see that because their primary livelihood was hunting, there's always been a strong connection between hunting and war. So, for example, the Mongols would go on the Great Hunt, the yearly hunt, where they would just kill all the animals in this like cone of battle, which was a sort of test, a role play, if you will, for actual battle. And so because they are always hunting, much of the techniques and strategy for hunting wild game on the steppe are easily transferable to hunting humans. And so there's this, they're essentially professional soldiers. We're essentially dealing with professional soldiers because their entire way of life is fighting in one way or another. And even with the manpower, even with the technological limitations of antiquity, professional soldiers are generally going to way overperform their opponent. One can think of the Spartans versus the Persians in the Persian Wars. A slight technological advantage with heavier armor, a longer spear, and a professional warrior tradition made these Spartans just a sight to behold and could just destroy hordes of Persians. And you couple the strategic mobility of the horse with the firepower of the composite bow, with dirty tactics, and you have, probably the single greatest fighting force in that part of the world in that part of time.
Right. Well, you really said it that they're the masters of hit and run strategy. Again, they're really accredited for three big things as far as military history is concerned: is the domestication of the horse, the creation basically of the chariot. Although there's some speculations to the exact origin of it. The chariot is from that area, and then really it's the use of well, I guess it's not that they are accredited for the creation of bronze weapons, but really but later on it would turn into the mounted archer and the mounted lancer that we'll see with the Sarmatians a little later on. So again, it's all just based on mobility, hit and run strategies. What did happen later on with Cyrus the Great is that Cyrus the Great was killed by the Scythian queen Taramas. I think I'm pronouncing that correct. And with their weapons that they used, it was really all bronze, and it was the short sword, the axe, the lasso, poison-tipped arrows, as you mentioned earlier, and then they also, I'm trying to think, well, I guess the mounted lancers were associated later on with the Sarmatians, whether they defeated the Romans around the Danube and east of the Danube. But yeah, I mean, I think you really nailed it there. The only thing I can really think of else to comment on is that I mean, Herodotus in his expedition of the Scythians is that, I mean, he really does confirm this as well, that just very warlike, very brutal. They're very the only things that they were really keen on defending was actually their buried nobility, because there were no walled cities or really permanent towns or villages or cities that they didn't have to defend. They did have this sort of religious commitment to defending their buried dead. And as a lot of 20th century and 19th century Russian archaeological expeditions would uncover, is that they were filled with gold and all sorts of trinkets. And also, interestingly enough, where we talked about like this, I think I mentioned the Scythian comb earlier on that has like depictions of battles. A lot of Scythians were covered in tattoos of different depicting similar things, battles and hunting. So I think archaeologists in the past, I can't remember the guy's name, but he was trying to derive some sort of metaphysical or religious spiritual system out of that, but nothing really was sort of a dead giveaway in any terms of set of belief. But we did talk about earlier on how they probably worships some version of like a Eurasian steppe version of the sky god from the Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. And yeah, I think that's I think I'll probably keep it to that. Also, since they were really the first to use the chariot by 1000 BC, as you mentioned before, the chariot had been swapped out for mounted horsemen. And since they were the first to use it, they were sort of the first to do away with it, because again, the mobility options on just on horseback are far better than a chariot. And they probably realized that chariots require this certain amount of material upkeep. So again, I think the archaeology and the history is good enough to suggest that, yeah, they sent the chariot as far south as India, as far east as Manchuria. But I think just because of the steppe itself, there's really not a good use for it. And so they really just stuck to the sort of the mounted fighter, the mounted lancer, and especially the mounted archer, and they really just perfected that. I don't think they necessarily had to do anything else. They probably didn't feel motivated to civilize themselves. And I guess I'll say on one other point that you had mentioned earlier is that there is sort of this bizarre trend in history too, where people are trying to sort of clean up the historical image and reputation of the Scythians. Well, again, I mean, if we're just going off of Herodotus and all the evidence that we can collect from these burials in sort of the Pontic steppe that have been uncovered for the last really about 150 years. I mean, these were just an extremely brutal people and society and way of life. Again, as you mentioned, the hunting was sort of a proto window into how war would go. And we talked about how there were nobility women who were fighters who, depending if they were right-handed or left-handed, they would cut off the right breast if the woman was shot right hand with a bow. And but there were no graves for commoners, and so this would suggest that I think there's a lot of sort of left-leaning people in the humanities who would suggest, well, this is more of an egalitarian society. I'm thinking, well, no, it's just a sign that there was a nobility sort of warrior caste society where their women could fight. But again, as you said earlier, there's no baby formula in the Bronze Age, and so most of the women were commoners and would have to have raised children. And the women who fought were probably in a sort of nobility status.
Well, yeah, exactly, and I think this was considered very important by the Greek writers and the Roman writers, and similar accounts were given of the warrior women of the Scythians. Now, I don't think this trend continues with the Huns or the Turks or even later the Mongols, but in this Indo-Aryan period of the Western steppe, that is an observation made by many of these people. And you already mentioned that Thamyris, queen of the Scythians, killed Cyrus the Great. And it seems that this is where the legends of the Amazons come from. And that I would agree that it's unlikely that most Scythian women went through this sort of harsh treatment. I mean, given the left's modern day proclivity for self-mutilation, maybe it's no wonder they find the Scythians so endearing. But yeah, it was still a bit of a novelty, right? That's still a point for the Greeks. It was novel. It was exotic. It wasn't necessarily normative. And this gets back to other trends that we'll point out with the Spartans as well, and also the Vikings. That the idea that we get taught is that a more egalitarian society is going to be more peaceful. That's been the feminist trope since the 60s. And whenever you look at actual historical societies, especially ones that feminists like to hold up, like Sparta and the Vikings and the Scythians, these are the most warlike races of their day. So it's complete bollocks to argue that egalitarian gender roles are a precondition for a peaceful society. In fact, it's the opposite. The more egalitarian the gender roles, the more violent society is. And the Scythians and Sarmatians are, case in point. And we see that this oddity of having female warriors only really crops up in a few other places. Like the Vikings have the shield maiden, and unlike, say, emergency situations like women defending a fortress, like in feudal Japan or medieval Europe, that's just an emergency situation. That's not normally what happens. And women can use gravity to their benefit, like when they drop a millstone on the head of the Greek commander Antiochus III. I think it's in the siege of Argos. But yeah, those were sort of unusual niche exceptions, whereas for the Scythians, it seemed to be more of a normative subculture. But again, that's just kind of an oddity. When we look at in the written accounts that we have, the first great nomadic people are the Cimmerians. We don't know much about them. Herodotus says that the Scythians drove the Cimmerians out and of the Ukrainian steppe, and they helped the Assyrians defeat Urartu in what is today Armenia and eastern Turkey. And later they sacked and plundered Lydia. And lastly, they were finally defeated by the Assyrians, by Esarhaddon and others. And the Cimmerians pretty much disappear from the record. But what's instructive about the Cimmerians, though, is that they sort of show us a trend that we will see time and time again on the steppe. One nomad is displaced by another, and that creates this cascade effect of migration. And the three great migration routes are through the Caucasus, usually into Asia Minor, east of the Caspian Sea down into Persia or India, and then into Europe. And there's a period of time as well called this, where the Scythians, when they themselves eventually become displaced by the Sarmatians, create a Indo-Scythian kingdom in what is today Pakistan and northwest India. And so India, Iran, Europe, and Asia Minor are the great displacement routes that these migrating forces take. So the Cimmerians probably conformed in many ways to the norms and conventions of the Scythians. We have less written about them. Herodotus doesn't seem to distinguish them very much at all from the Scythians. So, but this is sort of the first real literary account we have of these people. And of course, they were no match for the Assyrians who quashed them. And in many ways, this sort of ethos of cruelty and barbarism of the steppe is sort of carried on in popular culture with Conan the Barbarian, because Conan himself is called Conan the Cimmerian. And I don't think it was an accident on Howard's part that he named his brutal warrior hero after the earliest known steppe nation.
Right. Well, as you mentioned before, as far as specific conflicts are concerned, they sacked Urartu as well as sacking Lydia. They were defeated by Alexander the Great at the river crossing battle, which I forget the specific name of, but of course we will get into Alexander the Great here, probably here fairly soon in a few episodes. But one thing that they really did well is because their society and just way of life was just based on, really centered around the horse, or at least the ability to keep moving. They were great at establishing not only trade routes, but also raiding routes through the Caucasus, as you said before, the eastern coast of the Caspian, or just heading straight west into the Hungarian plain and down to the north side of the Danube in modern day Romania and so on and so forth. So again, there's this great mobility that they had, but again, when forced into a conflict with more sort of conventional standing armies, I think it's fairly evident that really the Scythians and the people that followed them from that same part of the world really were kind of a one-trick pony just in terms of tactics and strategy, because they're good at sort of these hit and run tactics where they could lead an army, sort of like make them, like sort of like a feigned retreat type of a thing, where they can have a conventional army chase them off into the steppe, therefore sort of taking the conventional army off of its campaign route and act as more of this harassing type of a military force. But in terms of winning these more technical campaigns with trained enemies with armor, I think the Scythians really were limited. Really what they're great at is just raiding undefended sort of like villages and towns, and then plundering from that, and again, just not tying themselves down to any one sort of infrastructure or material that would make them sedentary. I mean, again, that was just their way of life. And when you and I were talking earlier, I can't remember who what the account was of a captured Scythian or something like that, and someone told him that, well, why are you guys such cowards and why don't you fight us? And he said, well, again, it's not that we're not cowards, it's just that this nomadic it's just our way of life to be on horseback and to constantly keep moving. So again, that really just did set up, had this cascading effect for how it affected the rest of their culture and society. I think their use of the recurved bow as well. A lot of the burials, again, that's as far as archaeology itself is concerned. There's hundreds of burials that have been found of Scythian nobility. It's not just several dozen. It's actually numbers in the hundreds. And I can't remember the name of the lecture that I watched, but the professor had stated that there was a nobleman, or like a sort of like a war chieftain, that was buried with his wife, with their slaves, with his horses, and it was something like 5 or 6 horses, and I think it took something like several thousand trees to cut down to build the burial mound that they wanted to build for the guy. And it was just filled with tons and tons of gold. And again, a lot of the gold is depicting either hunting or warfare. But again, I mean, I think you and I are in agreement that it would be difficult to clean up the historical image of them in a way that would make them commensurate with modern egalitarian societies. Again, I think we can both agree that's just sort of a historical and academic trend set by the cultural revolution of the 1960s. So I'm trying to think, as far as broadly on this, of the Scythians and the Sarmatians, they were just written about as sort of like a brutal people too. Again, they were referenced. Again, when you read Herodotus's account, it's almost very similar to De Germania by Tacitus, in the sense that we talked about, like Tacitus would talk about the Germans, how they, women were involved in certain male roles. But again, that's where the ears perk up of modern day feminists, and I think, well, hold on a second, because again, this would suggest a warrior caste society and not necessarily some sort of egalitarian effort to bring women up to the level of men on all roles. But yeah, I think the major conflicts that they are accredited for is sacking Lydia and Urartu, and defeated by Alexander the Great. Again, very limited in terms of tactics and strategy, but for the steppe, they're really kind of are just products of their time. Again, this is the Bronze Age, so they were completely dependent on hunting, and I think the Scythians, I mean, we can at least credit them for great use of gold and bronze, and really just domesticating the horse. I think that'll be their historical legacy from here on out.
Mm-hmm. Now, from the written accounts, there's really only 2 major campaigns that the Scythians are engaged in, and that we have, and they're essentially defensive. One is Darius the Great's expedition into Thrace, and then up into what is today Bulgaria and Romania. And the account you mentioned earlier, Terminal Philosophy, comes from this expedition. One of the Persian ambassadors or generals, when he finds a Scythian who's leading the forces he can talk to, he's like, "Well, why do you cowards keep running?" And he's like, "Well, this is how we live our life. But if you want to see us stand and fight, attack the graves of our dead," which Darius didn't do. He didn't take on the Scythians in a fight. Now, the actual effectiveness of Cyrus's expedition is debatable. Some think he failed. Some think he succeeded in making an impression on the Scythians to cow them. Others think the expedition almost failed. But at the end of the day, however you want to slice Darius's expedition, the Scythians retain their independence and their autonomy, much like the Greeks would a couple decades later at the Battle of Marathon. And the other major campaign involving the Scythians is Alexander the Great. I guess actually a third one would be Cyrus. Cyrus leads the one against the Massageti, and he's ultimately defeated and killed by Tamaris, but we don't have a whole lot about that. Alexander's campaign, again, what we do see is that there's the Greek sources highlight the sort of pride and arrogance of the Scythians. There's an incident in Sogdiana where the king or the ruler, the chieftain says, unless Alexander has winged men, he can't climb this face and attack me. And Alexander does find some bold men who climb the steep face of the rock to get up there. And they say, we found the winged men, surrender to us now. The river crossing you mentioned was the Exartes. Alexander the Great, through a combination of missile throwing, catapult, ballistas, and then having a mixed formation with slingers and archers who crossed first to meet the Scythian horses with their own missile fire, and then his own companion cavalry to deliver the hammer blow. Effectively dealt with them tactically. Also, Alexander seems to have been immune to the tendency to fall for their tricks and Parthian shot techniques. But fundamentally, though, it was a scorched earth policy that made the land uninhabitable for the Scythians, so that they just weren't going to attack his northern flank because they couldn't live there. There was no pasture land, there were no cities, no trade routes. And other than that, we don't have a ton more about the Scythians. Now, the other group that we want to mention is the Sarmatians. Now, in many ways, they seem to have a lot in common with the Scythians. They seem to be, brutal, equestrian. They also have the warrior woman motif. But what they bring, which is totally new, is the mounted lancer. The mounted lancer is the other piece of the hammer anvil combo of the great nomadic hordes that will continue all the way up until the advent of gunpowder in the 16th century. And with the mounted lancer, again, you could expect to see protection similar to that of the Scythian nobleman, presumably now with iron scale mail and the lance. And what's highly important about this is that it's this archetype of the mounted lancer, which is picked up by the Goths, who use it to defeat the Romans at Adrianople, and then spread further west, which gives us the germ idea of the knight, the mounted medieval warrior, the knight. And in fact, there is some speculation that if there was a historical Arthur, the historical Arthur might in fact have been a Roman commander of a Scythian band, a Sarmatian band of mounted lancers that we have record on being stationed in Roman Britain. That's fairly highly speculative. That seems to be the main contribution of the Scythians, the Sarmatians, to this Scythian culture. In most other ways, the Scythian archetype is preserved. It's just that the Scythian or the Sarmatians bring to us a new component. And this hammer and anvil strategy of the horse archer and the lancer is ultimately married into a single fighting unit, the cataphract, which is then copied by the Romans in the 6th and 7th centuries AD. But again, this then sets the stage for nomadic warfare for the next 2 millennia.
Right. I actually do recall coming across that as well, where the Sarmatians, it's speculated that they played some sort of hand in this later on, this sort of like almost like proto-medieval conception of the knight and like a sort of a mounted knight kind of a thing, although that's highly sort of speculative. But yeah, I do recall coming across that as well. By the time the Sarmatians had got into places like Western Ukraine, they were already very accomplished horsemen and just great at sort of the just occupying pastoral lands. Again, they did share this role in defeating the Romans with the mounted lancers themselves, but again, as we talked about before the video, with this sort of scorched earth policy and the destruction of pasture lands, I mean, well, that appears to be something that the Sarmatians or the broader confederation of the Scythians really didn't have an answer for. But again, I think they did have a positive influence in terms of military strategy, where if you have a highly mobile force with reliable weapons and some disciplined horsemen to go along with them, well, then you can actually lean into that fairly well, and you can defeat unmounted infantry fairly easily with your speed, and you can also lead successful raiding parties against undefended settlements. And really, that's what they did for centuries. Um, as far as the Sarmatians are concerned, there was some Roman writings about them, but not quite onto the level of Tacitus with the Proto-Germans. But yeah, I think the Sarmatians also, as far as history is concerned, are typically thrown in the bin with the Scythians because again, they were derived from the Scythians, but they ended up going as far west as really Hungary. And there is sort of this broader sort of thesis that the Scythians were an origin group for people who later became the Iranians, as opposed to the other way around, and that the Scythians later became what we consider today as the modern day Mongols that intermingled with Eastern Oriental people, and that also the Scythians were the original people of who settled in areas like the Danube, the eastern portions of the Danube, into modern day Romania, and even Asia Minor peoples. So there's this sort of biological thesis that some historians of archaeologists have put forward, that the Scythians are the origin group of various types of peoples, including the Aryan invasions of India. I don't know if you have a specific opinion on that or not, but I did recall that coming up several times.
Mm-hmm. The one of the, I think, the important trends as well, not only did the Scythians and the Sarmatians create a trend that would dominate the steppe for the next 2,000 years, we've already mentioned that if you want to look at the Stone Age, it was maybe an age of infantry-dominated combat. The Bronze Age was dominated by mounted combat with chariots. The Iron Age is dominated by infantry combat, and we will return to the infantry revolution of ancient Greece and Rome in subsequent discussions. But the pendulum swings yet again in the 4th century AD with the mounted lancer. And it's not only copied in Western Europe with the knight and in the Eastern Roman Empire with the cataphract, it's also copied in India. It's with the Guptas. It's copied in China with the Tang dynasty. And so we see that this merger of the mounted lancer and the horse archer into what we would call the cataphract is dominant for half a millennium all throughout Eurasia. And it leads to another pendulum swing where cavalry becomes the dominant force up until the 14th century in AD in Western Europe. So they not only set a trend for nomadic warfare and way of life, they actually set a trend for all of Eurasia for the next 1,000 years. So the sort of influence of these two tribes is really difficult to exaggerate, at least in military terms. And I think one of the reasons why the cavalry revolution didn't happen sooner is because the Scythians and the Sarmatians were loose tribal confederations. And a lot of these loose tribal confederations on the steppe, as we see, spend most of the time fighting each other. The Scythians drove out the Cimmerians, the Sarmatians drove out the Scythians. And so as long as they're fighting each other, this military prowess isn't really brought to table on these other nations. Now, they briefly united the Scythian tribes united to destroy the Assyrians, possibly to pursue the remaining Cimmerian forces. But, we do have an example like that. And the most powerful empire of the day, Assyria, melted in face of a concerted steppe assault. And we would see that again in the beginning of the 4th century AD with the Huns, a concerted steppe assault that would lead, massive casualties to the Romans and the Persian forces they went up against. And so I think one of the reasons why this military prowess and this elite system took so long to become dominant on Eurasia was because of the political limitations of the nomadic peoples themselves. And it's really only when sedentary nations like China and Rome imitate this model that we really see the full potential of these tactics in the early Middle Ages.
Right. Well, as you mentioned, with like this pendulum shift in sort of military and tactical trends, where it goes from mounted to dismounted infantrymen and back again, is that it's really dependent on what I think you and I would agree with is just specific innovations on the battlefield in terms of armor or weapons or a new tactic developed that will cause this demand for a reemergence of either mounted or dismounted infantrymen. Again, with the Roman phalanx and high quality weapons and armor, they didn't necessarily need cavalrymen all the time everywhere on the battlefield. I mean, what they needed was just highly just disciplined troops with good armor and really just a tactical cohesion with other legions, and that's why the Romans were so successful. Again, as for the Scythians and as for this this broader trend of mounted cavalrymen, really, when as you mentioned before, with this speculated historical event of where the Scythian tribes and warlords, who, by the way, were also speculated to be like brothers and cousins and uncles of each other, when they did unite, there's some evidence that would suggest that they were very successful against different regional powers. But again, I mean, because of this sort of lack of civilizational vision, if you want to call it that, in terms of a Cliff Notes type of speculation, I mean, they really set themselves short in terms of making anything else of themselves rather than just masters of the steppe, masters of the horse, and also this sort of cultivation of or like this, they had some skilled artists with gold and bronze and so on and so forth. But again, a lot of the nicer weapons that the Scythians obtained was really through raiding and plundering south of the Caucasus Mountains into Asia Minor, and in modern day like Armenia and Georgia, so on and so forth. I think there is a really fascinating historical trend with where this pendulum swings. As we discussed in an earlier episode, there's not really a clear line between what separates ancient from medieval warfare, but some of the characteristics that can help separate the two are really innovations in armor and weapons and the use of certain battlefield assets like either a chariot or a mounted horse. So, but I think up until we get into the Middle Ages, where we have more advanced pieces of siege equipment and higher quality armor, and like higher densities of steel and things like that. I mean, it's kind of interesting because in this series we'll go deeper into the Iron Age, but then because we don't want to leave out any sort of important factions or peoples, we're sort of back in the Bronze Age now, where again we're kind of looking back into this window of like hit and run, and again they almost share some characteristics with a group of people like the Sea Peoples, where there's not necessarily this broader united faction, but you just have groups of people who are effective at raiding and sort of spreading this sort of sense of terror. And I think I'll probably leave it at that.
The main account we have of Scythians in war from a literary perspective is in the Dacian Wars of Tacitus. So Tacitus is invading Dacia, not Tacitus, Trajan. Trajan is invading Dacia, and the Sarmatians are kind of like on again, off again allies, typical nomads. And much like Anna Comnena, the Byzantine princess, would write of the Frankish knights a millennia later being irresistible in the charge, Trajan argued that the Sarmatian lancers were invincible in the charge. But basically his victory over them relied upon superior discipline and the inferiority of the Sarmatian campcraft, where he was able to surprise and attack the Sarmatians in camp before they could mount their horses, or before they could mount squadrons to assault his men. And he pulled them from their horses, and yeah, they really were asleep at the wheel on that one. And the Roman accounts say that on foot they're less than useless. So Trajan basically played to the Roman strengths and defeated them there. But nonetheless, recognizing the military prowess of the Sarmatians, they had a long and colored history as Roman mercenaries. Again, possibly even giving rise to the Arthur legend. And when we look at the development of equestrian technology, and it's really the steppe. For most of history that's developing this improvements to horses. So you get the chariots, and then you get mounted horsemen, then you get the saddle, and then you get the stirrup, and all of these, and it would stand to reason because the horse is life to these people, more than to other nations. And it's their lack of political unification that I think is what really prevents the full potential from being realized, except in a few edge cases like the United Scythian raid on Assyria, obviously the Huns under Attila, the Mongols under Genghis Khan. But again, that's not very often.
Right. Yeah, they kind of share that similarity with the Native American Indians, where the lack of unification probably would have served them better historically. And you're right. Under I did read under sort of the soldier emperor of Trajan in the Roman Empire. I mean, by 117 A.D., there was all these expansions northward, far north of the Danube, into the region of Dacia, and as far east into places like Iberia and modern day Albania, and so on and so forth. But again, on both sides of the Black Sea, Trajan's forces did encounter this sort of again, this confederation of different types of steppe peoples that are that again were the Sarmatians, and again just these bands of Scythian warriors. I don't think that there's any other. I mean, really, kind of after the third, like second to third century A.D. I mean, that's where the Scythians and the steppe peoples sort of retract historically because of the expansions under Trajan. Again, this lack of unification, and also, again, it's worth mentioning a few times just because. I mean, their tactical sort of they're sort of just like a one-trick pony in terms of their military capability. They can't really take a sort of robust or conventional army head on. So what they're reduced to is again just migrating between pastoral lands and sort of looking for soft targets. Especially this would be true for the Parthian Empire, again, sort of by not so much the Median, or the Medes, but further east than that, east of the Caspian, on the eastern coast of the Caspian, where the Parthians were less, they had less troops sort of stationed on their frontier, and there were successful raids that I read about in the first and second century AD. But yeah, I think we're in agreement that this sort of lack of unification and sort of this tactical rigidity of just retaining themselves just to horses, well, it was great in certain cases, but in terms of fighting forces like Alexander or these more the more like imperial Roman forces proved to be, I mean, they proved to be just not up to the task, really.
Exactly. I think we're about out of time. Is there anything else you'd like to leave us with before we wrap this up?
No, I think we've summed it up pretty well. I mean, again, there are a lot of other peoples throughout history similar to the Scythians, where again they sort of organize their society around something like a horse or something like the land itself, and they become really good at a handful of things like domesticating horses or building constructing certain types of weapons or tools, but it proves to be sort of civilizationally lacking because they left out all these other aspects of a society that they probably could have used, and the Scythians are a really good example of that. I mean, again, I think we agree that they're quite a brutal peoples, but they're really, I mean, I think if we're being fair to some extent, there wasn't really many other opportunities or options that those peoples would have had coming out of the Stone Age. It was sort of par for the course for that part of the world. Again, not to be some sort of heavy-handed imperialist, but again, in order for those people to go up the ladder of progress, colloquially speaking, I mean, it might ultimately just require the what I guess just being conquered by more civilized types of peoples, or at least the introduction of other types of things like innovations, like, I don't know, say the construction of infrastructure or types of architecture, or even a legal system like the Persians were more well known for. So, but yeah, it's been interesting for this episode.
Yeah, thanks again, Terminal Philosophy.
Yeah, thanks, man.
This is Ty Lewis of the Prince of Folly podcast, signing off.